For over 3,000 years, the Gondorian army was the wall that kept most of the lands beyond the Anduin safe. Even after over a millennia of decline, it continued to fight a bloody war of attrition against Sauron's forces, and even the Dark Lord himself was surprised by their continued tenacity. So in this video, we explore Gondor's army. Who did it consist of? What units and tactics did it use? And how did it operate? Before I start, I just want to say that Gondor's military obviously changed over the history of the Third Age. While I would love to do a video about the evolution of their military, I unfortunately must say that there simply isn't enough information for me to work with without heavily inferring and making lots of assumptions. That being said, I will briefly summarise what we do know about Gondor's historical military, as much of it was still relevant come the War of the Ring. In the early part of the Third Age, the Gondorian military was the premier fighting force in Middle-earth. Its soldiers were almost entirely of Númenórean descent, except for scouts and mounted archers who were made up of middlemen auxiliaries. As you can imagine, an individual Númenórean soldier was tall, strong, durable, and could have well over a regular lifetime's worth of fighting experience. The army itself also seemed to boast a complex and efficient system of logistics, as evidenced by Gondor fighting offensive campaigns far from their own heartland. Due to the effectiveness of the individual Númenórean soldier, as well as their superior arms and armour, including the fearsome steel bow, the Gondorian army was heavily focused around heavy infantry, and behind them, skilled archers who could easily outrange their opponents. The height and strength of the soldiers made them difficult to overwhelm in melee combat, meaning an enemy force required superior maneuverability or a huge numerical advantage. However, one thing the Gondorian army lacked was a cavalry force. They fielded very little horsemen, and most of those were scouts or, as mentioned earlier, light cavalry that weren't of Númenórean descent. Despite this apparent weakness, the Gondorian army was effectively unbeatable in the first half of the Third Age. Unfortunately, Gondor's military deterioration started shortly after it reached its zenith in 1050 of the Third Age. The kingdom now had massive borders, the Dunedain could not replenish their numbers as quickly as their enemies could, and a handful of poor kings led to the military's obvious waning. On top of that, the Dunedain were continuing to weaken as individuals. Gone were the days of 7-foot-tall Númenórean giants who lived for over 300 years. While the average Gondorian soldier was still much better than an enemy soldier, the gap was beginning to close. It was during this time where Gondor truly started to make use of allied middlemen, most notably the Northmen. Following the alliance between King Romandakill II and King Vidugavia of Rhovanion, Northmen began to enter the ranks of Gondor's army, even being able to reach high positions. This not only plugged the manpower shortage, but also the tactical deficiency of lacking a proper cavalry force. However, the Northmen would usually act as allied cavalry rather than properly being incorporated into the Gondorian military, but their presence alone may have sparked a change because while Gondor never fielded a large cavalry force, they did use them in later conflicts. But Northmen or not, the next 500 years saw Gondor's military begin to buckle under pressure. The Kinstrife Civil War saw much of Gondor's best blood spilt for zero gain, the loss of the navy, and saw the rise of a dangerous rival in Umbar. The Great Plague devastated the population, causing the Gondorians to abandon their outer garrisons, and the arrival of the Wainriders saw Gondor suffer a humiliating defeat, and saw the end of the Northman kingdom of Rhovanion. It was the Wainrider War which saw Gondor's military reorganise. King Ondahur was informed that Gondor was about to be attacked from both the south and east, so he split Gondor's army into two, a northern army responsible for the Anduin north of Osgiliath, and a southern army responsible for the Anduin south of Osgiliath. Although King Ondahur would not live to see it, his reorganisation worked, and the system was kept in place until the time of Steward Kirion, 500 years later. Steward Kirion would lead the northern army to stop the Balkoff invasion of Calanadon, and after the war was over, he would gift Calanadon to the Rohirrim. This shortened Gondor's frontier, and meant that the army no longer needed to be split. The time of the Stewards would also see the integration of the middlemen who made up much of Gondor's interior. At this point, most of Gondor's military was of purely Dunedain Númenórean stock. This integration would lead to something of a feudal system that still existed by the time of the War of the Ring, and this brings us to the War of the Ring. It goes without saying that Gondor's military was very different by the time of the War of the Ring. In the past, the kings had gathered together their armies and went off on long campaigns to crush their enemies. This would often lead to peace along a front for centuries. But now, Gondor was constantly under attack from both the east and south, and its long coastline was no longer safe, and thus the military had largely decentralized. Although the Steward was the most powerful commander in the country, a lot of power had also fallen into the hands of the local lords. We can also see that three loose tiers had emerged in the military: elite units, the regular army, and levies from the fiefdoms. Let's talk about the elite units first. The ones that we know of are the Rangers of Ithilien, the Citadel Guard, and the Swan Knights of Dol Amroth. The Rangers of Ithilien were the newest unit, formed mostly in the aftermath of the loss of Ithilien in the late 29th century. Even by the War of the Ring, its members were still the sons and grandsons of those that had fled. They were led by Faramir out of the hidden refuge called Heneth-Anun in northern Ithilien. There were probably only a few hundred of them, but they served their purpose well. They were skilled trackers and ambushers, as evidenced by them destroying a convoy of Haradrim during the War of the Ring, and later ambushing a company of Easterlings who were actually planning on ambushing the host of the West. The Citadel Guard were a unique unit tasked with the defense of the Citadel, and the White Tree in Minas Tirith. These soldiers were arrayed in the best equipment Gondor had left, including helmets made of mithril, and acted as something of a ceremonial honor guard. They were supposed to be highly disciplined, although their skill and effectiveness was never truly tested as they never seemed to leave Minas Tirith. But in the case of Beregond, he was able to kill 3 of Denethor's servants quite easily. Their numbers were unknown, but there were at least 3 companies of them, and each one had its own storehouse and armory. The final and perhaps most devastating unique unit were the Swan Knights, led by Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. They were heavy cavalry, mostly made up of members of the House of Dol Amroth. When Legolas looked upon them, he could easily tell there was elven blood running through their veins. Their bravery and effectiveness was demonstrated plenty of times during the Siege of Gondor and the subsequent Battle of Pelennor Fields. They were often leading the charge or holding the ground when other soldiers had already fled. Like the other units, their numbers were unknown, but they were also probably no more than several hundred. Now let's talk about the regular military. But who is the regular military? Well, these are the guys in the direct service of the Steward, manning places such as Minas Tirith, the Ramesakor, Osgiliath, and Caer Andros. They were skilled and brave fighters, as they demonstrated during their retreat to Minas Tirith, where they took heavy losses, but inflicted many times more upon the forces of Mordor. We actually don't know much else about them. They were probably mostly of Dunedain descent, drawn from Minas Tirith and the surrounding lands. Their exact numbers are also unknown, but it was probably in the realm of 4,000 to 5,000. Notably, this number seemed to include a small number of cavalry held in reserve at Minas Tirith. And finally, let's talk about the levies from the fiefdoms, led by the captains of the Outlands. At the end of the Third Age, these guys are the bulk of Gondor's army, and with the exception of those from Pelargir or Dol Amroth, they're mostly middlemen or of mixed descent. Straight away, it's very much worth mentioning that these guys are a diverse bunch, and their quality and equipment differed depending on where they were from. We get a decent look at them during the Minas Tirith chapter in The Return of the King. From some places, these soldiers were clearly specialised to fight in a certain way or with certain weapons. For example, Lossarnach produces well-armed axemen, and Morthond produces skilled bowmen. Some places are wealthier and the levies are of better quality, being uniformed and well-equipped. The men of Pinnath Gelen wear green uniforms, and the men of Dol Amroth are well-armoured and carry many banners. But from some places, these soldiers are little more than a cobbled-together militia, bearing whatever weapons they can find. These types of men arrive from places such as Anfalas, Lamadon, and the Ethir Anduin. From Anfalas, they're described as herdsmen, from Lamadon as hillmen, and from the Ethir as fishermen, hardly words used to describe soldiers. With the exception of the Swan Knights from Dol Amroth, none of Gondor's regions seem to produce cavalry. These men were called to defend Minas Tirith, but here we also see the great deal of autonomy they have. Many of the captains of the Outlands send a mere fraction of their strength, not due to selfishness, but due to the threat from Umbar. The force that arrives at Minas Tirith is a little short of 3,000. From Lossarnach, only 200 arrive, yet nearby bystanders were expecting 10 times that number, and some of the lords don't actually show up. Angbor, the Lord of Lamadon, sends only a few of his men, while he himself takes up command of Gondor's coasts. How many levies does Gondor have? Well, it's unknown. In one of my very first videos on this channel, I put Gondor's total strength at around 25,000. In hindsight, I'd probably put it a bit higher, but there's a very good chance that about 70% of that number were levies of differing quality. After the end of the Third Age, the Gondorian military probably went through another reorganization. Under King Alessa, Gondor and the reunited kingdom as a whole probably centralized, and a large standing army once again became the norm. This is implied by the fact that in the years of Alessa's reign, Gondor's army, aided by Rohan, went far afield in the east and south to deal with the remaining enemies of the Free Peoples, something that they hadn't done in over 1,000 years. Although it's unlikely they ever matched the glory of their ancestors, the army of Gondor must have once again become a powerful fighting force. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it interesting. I hope it has provided some insight into what Gondor's military was like. Unfortunately, Tolkien never gave us in-depth insight like he did with Rohan's military, but he provided enough bits and pieces for us to glue something of a decent picture together. Next up, we'll be covering Dale's military. It will be a 20-second intro, 2 seconds of me saying I don't know anything, and then a 20-second outro. Cheers, farewell, and remember, cavalry is for nerds. Real men ride other men into battle.